Hello, everyone. I'm David Sherfinsky, the U.S. correspondent for Context, the news website of the Thomson Reuters Foundation. I'll be serving as your moderator here today. We're here to discuss an important issue, the idea of universal social protection. There is a lot of evolving evidence on this topic, and we know the World Bank has committed to moving toward universal social protection, though there are many questions on how to get there. Interested groups are aware of the bank's commitments on this front and hopefully will make their voices heard on how well they think the bank is living up to those commitments during the discussion here today, when we will also hear from a representative from the bank on how their efforts are progressing. The World Bank has committed to helping move states toward achieving universal social protection, but has also promoted many schemes like poverty-targeted programs and conditional cash transfers. The panel will hopefully examine the implications of these policies and other approaches. More than half the world's population still does not have access to essential social services and social security, and developing sound programs and strategies to confront this daunting situation requires an immense amount of work and resources. And there are plenty of opinions on what the proper strategy or strategies should be. Among the panelists up here, Matthew Greenslade of Development Pathways will present key messages from his forthcoming book, which challenges the World Bank's approach to social protection over the last 2 decades. Matthew has worked on social protection in the UK government and is now an associate with Development Pathways, a global consulting group that helps design and develop social protection systems around the world. His book, Beyond the World Bank, The Fight for Universal Social Protection in the Global South, is being published later this year. Our other panelists include Angela Kasule Nabowe, the executive director of the Initiative for Social and Economic Rights, a not-for-profit human rights organization based in Uganda that is helping lead efforts on the Africa regional continent to utilize the AU protocol to the African Charter on human and people's rights on the rights of citizens to social protection and social security, to advocate for improved access to social protection on the continent. And Yamele Riolini is a senior advisor for social protection and jobs at the World Bank. At the World Bank, he has worked on issues including social protection, poverty, and human development across several regions, including sub-Saharan Africa, East Asia and the Pacific, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia, and Latin America and the Caribbean. And hopefully joining us virtually is Isabel Frey, the executive director of the Social Policy Initiative, a feminist think tank that focuses on social security policy based in South Africa. She started work as a commercial lawyer in Cape Town before eventually establishing the Studies in Poverty and Equality Institute, which is the precursor to the Social Policy Initiative. To start, Matthew has a presentation, and I'd also then like to invite the other panelists to deliver some initial remarks if they so choose, and then we can get into a bit more of a discussion and hopefully leave some time at the end for questions from the audience, if possible. So, Matthew?
Is this coming up on the screen? Can you get this on the screen?
Yeah, I don't see your laptop. Yeah, I'm gonna 1 second here. Let's see if reseating this will work. Excuse me, sir. I'll go ahead and put it up on screen.
Thanks. There we go. Hi, everyone. I think that's Isabel on the screen as well. Hi, Isabel. We can't hear you. It's on mute, but I was just about to do my presentation. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. I've just got 10 slides. I've written a book called Beyond the World Bank, The Fight for Universal Social Protection in the Global South. There we go. I'm defining social protection by its sort of narrow definitions, a combination of tax-financed and contributory programs. And this presentation is focusing on the tax-financed side, which is where there are the most issues to do with financing social protection, contributory benefits being paid for by contributions. And so one of the hypotheses in the book is that the World Bank has been over-promoting poverty targeting through proxy means testing. Proxy means testing is an approach to poverty targeting which uses observable characteristics of households, such as roofing material, ownership of a television or livestock, to estimate whether that household is in poverty. It's used because of a lack of documentation on incomes, which is common in low and middle income countries. It's not the only approach to poverty targeting. Another example is community based targeting, which is where members of the local community get involved in deciding whether households are eligible. And that's commonly used with proxy means testing. And there are other methods as well. But poverty targeting using proxy means testing does come with costs, one of which is high targeting error. I think a sort of typical targeting error might be sort of 50% of the eligible population actually being excluded from the benefit. High errors are not disputed, I think, and they arise in part because household incomes change a lot over time, and because household incomes can be very similar across large parts of the population, so it's very hard to distinguish between a poor family and a slightly less poor family. And high errors and a quite complicated targeting process means that the use of proxy means testing can cause social unease. There's an example in Indonesia where local communities actually, in one program, actually redistributed the benefit because they were so unhappy with the outcomes of the targeting using proxy means testing, and were distributing benefits in what they saw as a more equitable way or a fairer way. Poverty targeting generally inevitably creates a missing middle. So you have poverty targeted programs at one end of the income distribution and contributory programs at the other end for people in the formal labour market, and a gap in the middle, which could be the majority of the population which doesn't receive any support at all. And sort of related to that is the potential for poverty targeting to gain less political support. Now, this point is disputed, and I'm sure it will vary from country to country, but political support is absolutely critical to developing sustainable comprehensive social protection systems for the future. Countries vary in their choice of poverty-targeted and universal schemes. Now, I looked quite closely at 6 countries in the book. And to illustrate this point, Fiji uses a mixture of poverty-targeted and universal schemes. Indonesia, much more poverty-targeted. Uganda, it's a very nascent sort of system, but a mixture. Rwanda, much more poverty-targeting. Nepal, universal schemes. And Kenya, a mixture. But what is common to all these countries is that the World Bank has promoted, advised poverty targeting in all of them, though that's not the end of the story in Nepal, which we'll come to, and mostly using proxy means testing, apart from in Rwanda, I think. And the prevalence of proxy means testing, well, I estimate that it's used in 60 plus countries in social protection programs. I couldn't find any summary data in World Bank literature. I may have missed something, but this is just from searching country by country on the internet. Now, in contrast, donors rarely finance universal schemes. By donors, I'm including the World Bank, but also other donors, including DFID, which I worked for a number of years. So I'm entirely culpable in this story. I mean, there are very few examples. But recent research is that 52 low and middle income countries have universal and near universal schemes. The countries shown there. Not only do donors and the World Bank rarely finance universal schemes, they often oppose universal schemes. And I've had recent experience in Kenya of observing the World Bank opposing the government introducing a universal pension there. And I also, when I was working in Nepal, I saw the World Bank proposing poverty-targeting universal schemes there. There's a bit more to that story, which I'll come to. And there are examples from Uganda, where I've also worked, and Mongolia. I haven't worked there, but the World Bank recommended or pressured the government, I think you could say, to poverty target their universal child grant or child benefit. And there are other examples as well, those others that I've read about. So why does the World Bank, why do I think the World Bank has done this, this over-promotion of poverty targeting using proxy means testing? Well, for me, it applies a partial logic. I think there's a lack of standing back and taking it context by context, looking at the pros and cons of different approaches, poverty targeting versus universal schemes. Perhaps being dominated by the argument limited resources must go to those most in need, and not considering the wider pros and cons, including those costs that I mentioned, to do with targeting error and to do with political support for programs, which is obviously a very important part of the picture. That's my reading anyway. And an area where I do sympathise a bit for the World Bank, having worked for a donor organisation myself, the need for short-term results, the need to meet the SDGs. The World Bank has a remit of ending extreme poverty in a timely way. I mean, I don't know when was there ever a bigger remit for an organisation. And the need to show funders results and value for money in a reasonable time frame, in a 3 to 5 year sort of programme time frame. And I've certainly experienced that pressure myself. And obviously the incentive to arrange loans, which I'm guessing pushes staff towards using established instruments, perhaps are more likely to get through internal approval processes. Now, Having said all that, the World Bank has done a lot that is positive. It has advocated for the last 20 years for, probably longer, for expanding social protection coverage. It was ahead of other donors doing that. It has helped generate and communicate the evidence, still does that very effectively, communicating the evidence, supporting that advocacy, though I would argue it has used evidence, certainly in country context, sometimes selectively to support the instruments it's proposing. And it has expanded its own spending on social protection significantly, and staff working on social protection. And I'm guessing that hasn't always been an easy thing to do in an organisation where I'm sure there's a lot of people arguing for spending on roads and other things. And it has worked on aspects of social protection systems in many different countries, digital payment systems, etc. And coming back to Nepal, it has started to support universal schemes. So it supports the government of Nepal's delivery of universal schemes. So that's a positive sign. I think it funded a universal scheme in Sudan, a temporary scheme. I heard a rumour yesterday that it may do something similar in Libya. I don't know whether there's any truth in that. And it has produced publications in the last 3 or 4 years. Oh, I knocked. Sorry, I've lost a connection there. Give us a second.
Just try this here.
Should be back on in 1 second, please. Did the screen go black?
I don't think so.
Seems like we've lost it.
Okay, we've lost the connect. Let me just finish verbally. So the World Bank has produced publications making very positive noises on their commitment to universal social protection. Some of its messaging, I believe, a lot of its messaging still points towards poverty targeting. So there's an interesting sort of discrepancy there. But there are positive signs. It's very important not to forget that. Oh, now I can't move on the screen. So is there potential for the ultimate target is life cycle social protection comprehensive systems that are sustainable for the long term, that support different groups in the population over the life cycle, that protect them against crises. Now, having a comprehensive system, a universal system, rather than just a universal scheme, that can be delivered through tax-financed or contributory programs, and it can be delivered through universal and poverty-targeted programs. I'm not making the point at all that all tax-financed schemes should be universal. The point I'm making is that I think the World Bank too often has prejudged the issue in countries. So is there a way that the two sides, if you like, the World Bank and its critics like me, can come together to support governments in future? It's governments and people that are the most important, obviously, players in this whole debate. I'm a bit sceptical for the reason that I do recognise positive movement in the World Bank's position, but the World Bank also promotes something called social registries, which are now in more than 50 countries, which are designed to poverty target over a range of programs, not just one. So that seems to push in another direction. But perhaps we'll hear a different story on social registries, and I'll be very interested in that. Going forward, my plea would be for a more transparent weighing of costs and benefits of different approaches in the World Bank's support to countries, in a transparent perhaps review of its current support, perhaps wrapped up in its reform roadmap and the operationalization of that. You know what I mean. And to think in terms of national development rather than just always the poor, in inverted commas, which is going to be the key to poverty reduction in the long term. To think in terms of human rights and entitlement, which poverty-targeted schemes can cut across. With that, with apologies for the technical glitch, I will stop.
Thanks very much, Matthew. And now hopefully we can get Isabel back and connected. Since Matthew's presentation delved into the World Bank, I just wanted to see if our representative cared to offer any opening remarks, thoughts, refutations to any of what Matthew said.
Thank you, and I promise you the glitch was not intentional. I really don't know what happened. Usually these systems work. A few observations. I have to say thank you. We only got access to a 4-page summary of the book, so I cannot be too specific on the book issues. But first, I think thank you for acknowledging first that we all work to social protection, because honestly, I have here colleagues who are all into the countries. We all visit beneficiaries, and we are all committed to actually protecting the poor and the vulnerable and developing the systems. But there are clearly different visions on what that means, and I think that's what we're discussing today. And I reaffirm it, we are deeply committed to universal social protection. We just perhaps understand it differently. For us, a universal social protection system is a system of programs that work together in an integrated way to actually provide people what they need when they need. So it is not about a universal transfer, and I think there is some understanding, but we need to think about the system. And that's where perhaps some of the discussion is. We just see achieving universality in a bit different manner. Having said that, we all agree that we are far away from universalities. There are many challenges. And we also agree that the way we target has issues and misses people. I don't think we actually can disagree that. But let me tell you something. All countries target. Even the Nordic states with large categorical programs, they do target through taxation. And taxation is also imperfect. So I would say all targeting systems, even universal ones that need to be financed, unless you are a resource-rich country, in Mongolia, Iran, they actually started with universal basic income service, but then they didn't continue. But these were resource finance. That's a different story, but let's put them apart. Unless you're a resource-rich country, you have to target, either in the way you give benefits or in the way you collect. Now, if you have a solid targeting system, solid taxation system in place, strongly progressive, like the Nordic states, categorical transfers or universal transfer are not necessarily a bad idea. Why? Because the power of taxation is that it taxes you over what you earned previously. So if you suffered a shock, if you actually, something bad happened to you, you're going to pay less taxes. And that's actually not a bad mechanism, because it's an ex post way to recover. But in many countries, we don't have these taxation systems. And then we start having systems where a large spending on a universal or categorical transfer needs to compete with 2% spending on education, sometimes 3% spending on health, spending on roads, infrastructure, water, and sanitation. And I think that's where perhaps we clash. We understand there are strong issues related to rights that are very valid. But then we also bring the budget into it. And I think our discussion is more, given the resources we can devote to social protection, given the competing needs in a developing countries, what can we do and what's the best solution? So this is the way we frame the discussion. That doesn't mean that we always have the right answer. That doesn't mean that in all countries we go, what we do is right. But that's how we would like to have a discussion. Given the resources, what's the best way? Now, let me also say now, I think part of the issue is really with what's called poverty targeting or proximate targeting. Let me first say, and then I'm going to also give some reflection on it, that despite the reputation it has, it was really poverty targeting what helped us in the past 2 decades expand cash transfers all over the world, in many countries. I personally had a dialogue with many countries, and many started with, we don't want to give handouts. We want to teach people how to fish. We don't want to give a fish. You don't know how many times I heard from governments that specific word in all languages. Now, targeting allows us to say you can do it efficiently. You can't claim that you're rural poor in a rural region where no access to education are poor because it's their fault. They are poor because they are not in the right environment. They didn't have the same opportunities. Hence, we need to support them. We need to build the human capital of the youth. We need to find ways to provide these people with jobs, but we also need to give them something to actually have a decent living. And that's how we have been expanded cash transfer in many countries. Now, interestingly, once we move to middle-income countries, the rights-based approach is picking up. It becomes more and more important. It's actually intrinsically it gets more into the discussion of the government. These are also countries that can afford a larger social protection budget. And there the discussion, I think, becomes really what can we do given the budget we want to really cover properly people. And that's perhaps, I didn't read the book, but I understand that's perhaps something that is missing in the discussion is the government view, the government aspects. It's true we do advocate quite often for proxy means targeting. Sometimes we may want, also to expand the discussion, but very often it's the government who wants that specific tool. Having said that, I think even in our thinking slowly, especially middle-income countries, we are expanding the way we think about targeting. There was a book that we produced that basically says no targeting method is perfect, and we should explore targeting methods that apply to the local context. For instance, I was once, I was working on Peru, and there were very vulnerable communities in the Amazon region. And I don't know honestly what the government did, but we had clear discussion that given the level of poverty all across the region, it may have perhaps made sense to just have a geographical targeting and cover everyone. So these are discussions we're having. The second discussion we're having in many countries is that we should distinguish between poverty targeting. You really want to give it only to the poor, to an income-based targeting level. I say that because part of the issue we face when we put a threshold, and that's a very technical issue, but it's important, it's that the mistakes are done around that threshold. So if you have a very, very low budget, and that's perhaps, I know you cite Ravaglion in your 4-pager, and that's perhaps a discussion, unfortunately, we can't have anymore, but we should have had. If you Ravaglion assumes actually a very generous budgets in his simulations because it assumes a budget that covers all the poverty gap. That's actually something we don't have. But if you have a very, very low budget, and you are targeting, and you want to cover the extreme poor, you put a poverty line that is very low. You are going to have many mistakes around that poverty line. That means you are going to exclude quite a few poor or extreme poor. When you become more generous, and that's perhaps what discussion we could have in middle-income countries, proxy means testing, I'm not saying about the tool. We are still going to have mistakes, but the mistakes are going to be among people who perhaps are less vulnerable. So we all look forward to a moment where we can increase that threshold so that, yes, we're going to be mistakes, because any targeting method made mistakes, but it's going to be among a population that is less vulnerable. Unfortunately, budget is a serious issue. We did simulations, and you don't even, but maybe, I was saying, maybe in the discussion we have, sometimes it's not even about increasing the budget, it's about maintaining the budget. So in Africa, we're having government who are still challenging, sub-Saharan Africa, we're still challenging cash transfers. Why should we give it? So we are actually fighting every day to keep the budget. If we would be able to increase it, then I think the discussion will become less dramatic. My final point is two things. That we should also focus the discussion, because that's a theoretical, an important argument, but we shouldn't mix targeting with delivery elements. You mentioned social registries. We shouldn't throw away the baby with the bathwater. Social registries are a fantastic instrument to actually know who your population are. You want to have a list with some characteristics of who the population are, where the poor are, but also where people with disability are, who your children are, who your elderly are. And then you will use a social registry to attach benefit to it. If you look at countries such as Chile, Turkey, yes, social registries are used for poverty-targeted instruments. We can discuss that. But that's not the purpose of the social registry. The social registries is a powerful instrument that integrates delivery of several services. And that is why we're pushing social registries, because we want to really, again, in the spirit of universal social protection, provide the right services to the right people in an integrated manner. Very often, poverty is always multidimensional. And so it's not by just giving cash transfer you're going to help people. You want to give the cash transfer, the training to the skills to the children, the social services to vulnerable people. And it's only when you employment opportunities, and it's only when you actually, to the same individual, provides these services that that person will be able to perhaps escape poverty. I'm concluding here, but I think this is our vision of universal social protection. We are very far from it, but I think we're making quite a lot of progress. And I welcome also a discussion not only on the, I would say, more narrow topic of targeting. I also would welcome a discussion on all what need to be done independently of the targeting to really get that integrated approach. We actually had a panel on disability and on inclusion of people with disability and LGBTQ, and it was very interesting how concrete some civil society recommendations were to really help us address these sources of discrimination in that case and vulnerability into our operation. So thanks again, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks very much for that. I'd like to invite Angela, if you have any opening remarks or thoughts on your experience in this area.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask that I speak from here. I come from the tropics, and I feel the AC is too much, so when I stand, it will be very close. So please, I'm going to request that I speak from here. Yeah. So thank you very much, everyone, for turning up for this and to have this discussion. So just two statistics, then I go into something very interesting. I come from a continent where 1 in 5 people have access to at least one form of social protection program. But also on that continent, of course, we are doing badly compared to other regions. But also the same continent, when you look at the spending on social protection, is just 0.4% of GDP. It is just 0.4% of our GDP. But sometimes when we mention these figures, people don't get the true human rights picture and why we try to speak about the targeting, the poverty targeting that the World Bank does. Before COVID, I attended a funeral of a colleague who is, by all standards, above average when you look at the statistics for poverty, employment, and all that. Very above average, and probably among the 1% of the population who are doing very well. And the wife had died of cancer. And at that funeral, the husband mentioned that when the wife was diagnosed with cancer, they sat at their dining table and they were basically going through what they own, their assets, and say, which one do we sell first to be able to afford the treatment that the wife needed. But that was before COVID. Fast forward after COVID, we did some research with Human Rights Watch around poverty, COVID-19, and child labor. But all the evidence was pointing to lack of universal social protection, because that is why children as young as 9, I personally visited mines in Karamoja, one of the poorest regions in the country, and I met girls as young as 9 in gold mines. And the reason why those children were in those gold mines is because people were so affected by COVID that these children had to go out and work to be able to supplement family income. And so it became so apparent that in the absence of universal social protection, that is why you also have children going into child labor. And when they go into child labor, you make the problem worse. So going back to how the targeting is done is that when COVID hit, there were so many people who felt that they were okay, they were doing very well. There are people who were employed, but they lost their jobs. There were people who were in businesses, but because of the lockdown, their businesses couldn't continue. There were layoffs and all that. And all of a sudden, you have people sliding back into poverty. And we always joke in our countries that you're one hospital bill away from poverty. And what does that mean for the policy around targeting is we are not looking at, what happens to people. Like, you're doing targeting for the poor, but today I'm fine, and tomorrow things are completely different. So basically you're back to zero. And for us, when you look at the targeting that is done and being pushed by the World Bank, we are saying that it ignores the sliding scale of vulnerability, and it is very easy for someone to become vulnerable at any time. So it complicates a lot of things. But besides that, in Uganda we have a social protection program for older persons over the age of 80. For some regions, like Karamoja, there are different considerations there. The age is a bit low. And what that program has been doing is we have the national ID, a digital ID. This is something also the World Bank has been pushing, and it's for good reasons. You want to avoid fraud and all that. But for one to be able to access that social protection program is you must have that ID, and it is the sole requirement. And without that national ID, you're left in the blank. So national ID per se is not a problem because it improves so many things. But the way the system design is, there are many challenges around that because we live in a country where people do manual labor for many years. So the system can't capture their fingerprint. And so because of that, they are not able to access social protection. But also, there are also challenges with birth registration. Many of these people do not have birth certificates. And so because of that, people were second guessing their ages. And it brought a lot of problems, but a key challenge. And sorry, I have to speak like I'm a practitioner, so I move around. So I've interfaced with this, and I'm talking about lived experiences. Before Christmas, end of year last year, we were doing some research around coverage of that grant. And I was in Karamoja in a district called Napak, and I met two sisters. They are identical twins. And one of them was receiving cash transfers, and the other twin is not receiving. And the reason why the other twin is not receiving is she does not have a national ID. And talking to her, this was really traumatic for her, because the way the system has been designed, it's like it's either this or you don't get. And so we have challenges, but people have other forms of identification. And where you acknowledge that there are challenges with the system, I think there should be some leeway for people to be able to manage that. I want to go to another issue around financing. So the argument by the World Bank is that where you have limited financing, you have talked about budgets, that targeting and looking at, for instance, the poverty and all that would be the most useful way of doing that. But we know that that is not really making progress for us, because we should be talking about how do we engage countries to do mobilize domestic resources. Because when you look at our countries and the things that we are struggling with, we know that we could raise resources through progressive taxation. Our countries could do progressive taxation. We could raise resources there. But also we have mineral resources in our countries. We have oil. Africa is a rich continent with all these resources. And if we could leverage that, then we should be able to finance our social protection systems and advocate for universal social protection. I mean, I go to spaces in different African countries. We do engage with the African Commission on Human Rights. And it is so disturbing when states are reporting for people to argue even resources. As like, what are we doing with the resources that we have? And one of the things, we have petitioned the East African Parliament around the state of public services in our countries, and I'll come deeply to that, and around social protection and what it should be. It's like in most of our countries, there is this madness around tax exemptions, and we've not done any cost-benefit analysis. We do not have evidence to show that actually we are gaining from the tax exemptions, and we are losing a lot of money in tax exemptions. But also when you look at the illicit financial flows, and I'll give you an example of Tanzania, there's studies that have been done, that just in 1 year, the amount of money that Tanzania is losing in IFFs, in illicit financial flows, can fund their social protection for at least 5 years. And so for me, the issue of us having limited resources and why we should push for that targeting doesn't really make a lot of sense. And for the World Bank, another key thing that I would want to interest you in, and which we think that could really make a lot of progress on the country, is that in 2022, we got the AU protocol, the African Union Protocol on Social Protection and Social Security. I think for us, this is a key document. So the African Union Protocol on Social Protection we see it as a progressive instrument because it takes into consideration the peculiarities of the African continent. And in doing so, we believe that it would be a good tool for advocacy for most of our countries to be able to use it, to utilize it to roll out universal social protection, because it talks about sectors like health, it talks about education, and we know we have a challenge as a continent because World Bank and IMF pushed us into liberalization, and that liberalization saga led to privatization of critical services, health, education. So that means that actually we are in a more worse state because of that policy of liberalization, because people have to pay for education, including basic education. People have to pay for health care. That means a big proportion of people's income is going into services that would ordinarily be covered by the state. So if we could look at social protection holistically, and we have the World Bank pushing for strengthening of critical public services, I think that would make a lot of sense for our context. I argued with even DFID. When we were rolling out universal secondary education, DFID, because we did not have the necessary infrastructure to be able to roll out that program, they got private actors to do that program. And we did research, and we told them that it was not working out. And I want to also credit the World Bank, at least that in providing needed funding, part of what they have done is to provide funding for construction of seed schools. Seed schools are like public schools in areas where there is no coverage. You all know that the private sector will not go in places where they are not going to make profit. And we believe that government should be setting up schools. So there is some World Bank funding that is going towards education, where they are setting up schools in island communities, in very poor communities, to be able to provide education access to children in those areas. I think that should be a credit to the World Bank. And we believe that they should be pushing for more of that instead of privatization, because probably we've argued, we are running a coalition on the African continent as the Initiative for Social and Economic Rights on reclaiming public services, because we believe that probably what is also driving up corruption on the continent is because people have to pay for basics, everything, and people are scared, like, will my children be able to go to school? If I get sick, will I be able to receive the medical care that I need? So in strengthening the public system, at least we have those covered, but we believe that the African Union Protocol on the rights of citizens to social protection, I think, gives us an entry point for us to be able to dialogue about also the obligations of the state when it comes to this. And maybe lastly, what I want to touch on is around why the targeting and this proxy is problematic, is that when you push that agenda of targeting, you'll find that states are going to be comfortable in that. And actually, that is where we got the problem initially when it comes to economic and social rights with our states, because countries are arguing progressive realization, because the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights says progressive realization. That language took us far back. And so even in cases where you're arguing, yes, you have the resources, and should be able to show us how you have used the maximum of the available resources to be able to provide education, to provide health care, and such critical services. States are not able to do that, but they are just hiding under progressive realization. So when we start pushing for targeting, and yet our goal is universal social protection, I think it is going to take us backwards. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much. And if we can get Isabel back, I'd love to bring her into the conversation for opening remarks, if possible. Hello,
Hi.
Isabel.
Can you see and hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation to be part of this panel. Social security and The question of universalism is something that we do a lot of in our work in South Africa. Johannesburg, South Africa is where we're based. So I love following on from Angela because it's clear that she is arguing for the return of a universal welfare state, which I think is something which really is a political project that should be looked at. But I want to start from a rights-based perspective, but initially to say that social security, as part of the broader definition of social protection, is a critical pillar of stable and resilient democracies globally. We talk about security, we talk about human security, but we would argue that in the absence of social security, these other securities are not capable of being advanced because there's no strong foundation for societies and for building resilient communities. Functionally, social security is basic income. And as basic income, universal access to social security is recognized, as has been said, as a human right everywhere. In South Africa, in addition, it's a justiciable constitutional right. And our Constitutional Court has deliberated on a number of applications and challenges to the way in which social security and social cash assistance grants have been rolled out. So it's definitely something which has teeth. The question of the broader context of the role of IFIs in supporting and promoting targeting is something which we find deeply challenging. And as Angela was saying, when you're talking about progressive realization on the one hand, and when your constitution places on government the obligation to reach universal access to social security, including social assistance for those unable to meet their needs. At a meeting that we had recently with the IMF, I asked, is that not an unconstitutional mandate then that is being placed on the National Treasury in terms of available and maximum available resources? So we see in South and Southern Africa in particular critical evidence of the downside of targeted social security and social assistance programs. And I just want to sketch out some of that, which I trust would lead to a sort of rich discussion in the next round of this panel. My focus will be on South Africa, though the work and the reach that we do is really within SADC. So in South Africa, the context, we're an upper middle income country. We have an unemployment rate of 41%. Which includes discouraged work seekers, those people who are unemployed and have given up looking for work because they don't find work. An unemployment rate of 41%, more than half the population lives in poverty. We're waiting for current poverty figures, but pre-COVID poverty figures show that 55% of people are living below the upper bound poverty line. South Africa also has the highest inequality level in the world, and that's currently 0.67 on the Gini coefficient. In this context, income from social security is a significant source of income, and particular income from social assistance. According to our last general household survey, while salaries make up 60% of national household income, social assistance cash transfers made up 50%. Looking at the main source of income into households, salaries are the main source of income into 53% of households. Social assistance grants are the main source of income into 24%, almost a quarter of households. Within this context, I argue that we need to look at social assistance in a very different way, in a new way. It's not just targeted poverty alleviation. This is a source of income distribution in systems in which market distribution, which has been the rise since the 1980s, is completely failing. So in the absence of market distribution, the regulation, distribution, and stabilizer of income distribution being the state in that tax and transfer modality that has been spoken of needs to be looked at and understood very differently. We know that dilution of targeted income, that targeting leads to a dilution of income for the recipient, which I'll refer to in a couple of minutes. And I think we also need to be mindful of the role of semantics. Are we talking about universal enjoyment of access to basic income? Are we talking about universal coverage of discrete and different programs. And ultimately, as has been raised, what is the impact on people and on the economies in which those people are? But I want to refer to a very concrete example of how targeting affected people. So South Africa's social security system is based on apartheid, in which white people were guaranteed employment because of job reservation. And so there is no social assistance on the books for working age people, despite the 41% unemployment between the ages of 18. So we have child support grants up to the age of 18 for poor children, meant to be, and pensions, means-tested pensions from 60 onwards. But 18 to 59, there is no income support, notwithstanding that you might never be employed. However, during COVID, and because of the lockdown, we argued at our social dialogue institute that we're part of, that we needed to see some cash transfers going to working age people. And so for the first time ever, that really important ideological barrier of giving money to poor people, working age people, was crossed. And so something was introduced known as a social relief of distress grant. It's 350 Rand per person, which is $18 per month for adults. But it was done on a means test. And this really shows the capricious results of targeting. So in a movie that we produced, funded by the UN SDG Fund, we interviewed beneficiaries who had applied and they traced their experiences. So basically, we had a situation where National Treasury was told the Department of Social Development and the Presidency that they had a budget. We know that 12 million adults were unemployed. The budget on 350 Rand reached 9 million adults. And so we saw a succession of adaptations to the means test on a 3-monthly basis in order to keep the number of eligible beneficiaries within the target, the budget. For people many people functionally illiterate, who had to use smartphones to apply, they were, in the last resort, just unable to follow, and there were huge errors of exclusion where the system basically rendered ineligible, definitely eligible people, to the point that in the last financial year, the Department of Social Development handed back billions of unspent rands for this program, not because there wasn't a need, but because of the system of targeting led to such confusion and exclusion. We saw a number of people in our film who had used the money, as in every great program, in order to try and generate more money. As soon as they started using it in order to make more money, they were kicked out of the system. So the punitive aspect of using the money to do what people are encouraged to do, in fact, I argue, creates the dependency. It's not the cash grant that creates the dependency, it's the targeting, the means testing that creates the dependency. I was in the UK over Easter, and during this period, a UK child poverty report was launched, which demonstrates a huge increase in child poverty in a northern industrialized country. Now, looking back, the UK child benefit was hailed as a pillar of the welfare state. It was a proud policy beacon of the last Labour government, but under the austerity of the Conservative administrations, not only has the value been frozen, but in 2013, means testing was introduced. There's a clear proximal relation between the means testing to the child benefit and the massive increase in child poverty in the UK. So on the one hand, we have the World Bank and the IMF driving policies of targeting with a narrative of insufficient fiscal take. In South Africa, we've had 30 years of successive personal income tax and corporate income tax cuts. And at the same time, as indicated, we have a national treasury that says we can't roll out universal access to social security and social assistance because we don't have money in order to do that. Yet universalism has decades of successful evidence of its ability to foster social cohesion, as Matthew was talking about, social cohesion and inclusion, as well as providing security against endogenous and exogenous shocks. Targeting dilutes benefit and forces household shaping, which we've seen in South Africa, where there is a pension paid, people start aggregating, which in itself then creates a vast number of tensions, and particularly the security of women in those kinds of forced comings together around targeted income is really something which is detrimental to their well-being, to their autonomy and independence. The way that targeting is done is inherently divisive. And there are numerous mechanisms. In fact, the World Bank, President Jamili, indicated this for taxing back transfers to better off people, which provides universalism at source. It reduces the stigmatization of being a grant recipient. It excludes the areas of exclusion at the point of source, and it reduces the costs of means testing as targeting. So now, just briefly turning to the progress of the bank, which I think we are at some stage also reflecting on. Within South Africa, we're part of SACU, which is South Africa, Botswana, Namibia, Lesotho, and Eswatini. It's a number of countries, and so there was a 2022 report on SACU and inequality. And we were very concerned at the clear recommendations for increased targeting of social protection schemes in this report. So, and it also seems to be contradictory. I mean, in the summary on the section, the report says that high spending on social assistance reduces poverty and inequality, which is, I think it's good that that's not argued against. It also says gaps in the targeting of social assistance programs dilute their impact of poverty and inequality, and it demonstrated 13.5% of poor people don't receive any transfers at all. And yet the same report concludes that the means targeting that as implemented by South Africa should be rolled out in other SACU countries where there are universal pensions. So there is a contradiction at heart, which is very disturbing. Just in closing, we talk about climate justice and adaptation and mitigation funds. We argued in South Africa that in countries of high unemployment and informal employment, we need to introduce universal unconditional cash transfers, which are not linked to job reskilling and job training. Where employment is not the norm, we need to look at ways in which income support and basic income can be transferred in a way which is not divisive and doesn't have huge areas of exclusion. Social security schemes, social assistance schemes can be highly self-financing, and a research report that my institute released in February shows that a decent universal basic income set at the upper bound poverty line can be 96% self-financed because of the stimulus and because of the economic stabilizer that regulating income distribution has. Now, these are ways of looking at social security not as poverty alleviation, but as economic policy. And the refusal to do so, we need to start asking, is it ideological, political will? And then finally, and I conclude taking a step back from social assistance, and the point of the World Bank, sorry, I'm not sure how to pronounce your name, and so Jamela, was that a universal coverage can be made up of different schemes. And again, the SACU report pointed this out, that there is a significant delay in the development of social insurance contributory schemes that reflect the realities of people in informal and atypical work in a way that excludes the ability of people to provide for themselves. So we don't say there's an either or. We do believe that there should be a universal basic income, which is taxed back, clawed back from those who don't need it to avoid areas of exclusion. But we also think that the IFIs need to direct private sector, banking, financial bodies to start developing the kinds of appropriate programs where people are not penalized because they've got lumpy incomes coming in, but can actually use that to build resilience across societies. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Isabel. And I'd like to ask, we heard some about what's often missing in the discussion is, government views. I guess what happens when countries or governments say, we want targeted programs, proxy means testing is what we can afford right now. I guess are those, to what extent can those be considered appropriate stepping stones to a more universal social protection scheme, or to what extent do they just need to be shifted away from entirely? Being mindful that Isabel is remote, I'd like to kick that off to you if you have any thoughts.
Thank you. I think Angela also touched on this, and this is the question of progressive expansion and progressive realization. In South Africa, very briefly, after 1993, well, after 1994, 93 being the last year of apartheid rule, there was a deliberate attempt to expand social assistance coverage to uncovered people, majority of whom were Black, who had had their citizenship taken away and sent into homelands. And this was done on an incremental basis. Initially, for instance, the old age pension was expanded to people of all races, and the child support grant was introduced, initially for children up to the age of 7, then 9, then 11, then 15, and now 18. There were also constitutional court challenges, as I indicated, where refugees, asylum seekers, and permanent residents were initially excluded, and they were included. Our argument on your question, can we reach universal coverage progressively, is yes, but we would need to see a comprehensive plan, which then gets rolled in successively. And too frequently, governments stop at a certain critical point, and it might sometimes has to do with elections, it has to do with kind of who the ruling party's electoral support is. But we also, and this is what our research has been looking at, which is the critical critical intervention of scale, which you do not have if you are having, if the amount that you're transferring and the number of the recipients are too small, then it will be poverty money trickling down into communities. Our argument is that if you have scale going in and a universal system to begin with a shock, and this is where IFIs and other donors can come in to support that initial 1 or 2 years of the need for investment, or looking at other monetary policy tools in order to get that money, you can then start generating the returns that make it affordable. But if you start with too small an investment, we would argue you will not have a government, especially not a national treasury, who will ever say, we have sufficient money for it to be rolled out. So there's a political economy in the answer to your question.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to kind of open it up to any of those in person, the idea of sort of this progressive move toward a more universal scheme versus a more wholesale, overhaul of the kinds of things that the World Bank has been trying to do.
On the specific question, can poverty-targeted schemes be a stepping stone? I'm thinking of the situation of Kenya, where I think the World Bank deserves some credit for establishing social protection, helping the government, helping to establish social protection in the first place, but, and the idea of government spending on social protection. But now you have a situation where it's opposed the government in its introduction of a universal pension, and at the same time wanting to go further on poverty targeting. The universal pension would cost about $160 million a year, I think. World Bank opposes that and introduces a loan for predominantly for poverty-targeted scheme of $250 million. Okay, it's a multi-year scheme, but for the same money, they could have been helping to pay for a chunk of that universal pension. And the program it's supporting, I think evidence shows targeting is little better than random. a little better than random. What right has the World Bank got to oppose something that the government wants to do when the costs are clearly realistic? Moreover, as I understand it, in implementing the programme, the World Bank is pulling hard-pressed government officials away from the universal pension and other things and into the process of implementing poverty-targeted schemes. And you get into the issue of path dependency there. To implement these very complicated, it's a complicated process, proxy means testing. You're developing institutions and expertise in very low capacity environments that may not be then easily switchable to universal schemes further down the line. So I'm very concerned about the issue of path dependency, and I am sceptical, although I do accept every context, every country is different. I'll stop there on that one.
Thank you. A couple of reflections. Two reflections. What I heard here, I don't know the specific context, but to me, sometimes it's just bad implementation, and that's actually something we should address. It's true we are pushing for IDs. We think IDs are fundamental, but honestly, I've worked in many countries where we were telling the government not having an ID should not be a reason not to consider you for a transfer. I've been telling it to government. So let's distinguish bad implementation from and I don't know Uganda, I don't know the, in general, let's distinguish bad implementation from a more let's say, high-level discussion. We actually, yes, targeting or not, we don't want lack of services, including IDs, affecting the ability to for the poor to receive a transfer. And there are ways around it. Again, with mistakes. All what we do has mistakes. We try to minimize these mistakes. And that's a lot of our work, trying to minimize the mistakes. But social policies will never be perfect. They are not perfect in the US, they're not perfect in Europe, they will never be perfect anywhere. So it's a constant progress. So ID, I think, is something. Another thing I don't think we will ever doubt is that we want universal access to education and health. I don't think you will find one expert in the bank that says, financial hurdle should not be on the way to education and health access. I mean, now, how much we can afford of good education, good health, again, it's a story of budget, but I think the principle is everyone should get an education, and health should be accessible universally. Now, how we arrive there, it's actually a complicated issue, but we all definitely support it. I think you actually mentioned a very good point on resource mobilization. We push for it. I think, honestly, it's difficult to achieve results with very, very low spending. And you're mentioning low spending. And the resource mobilization should go hand in hand with how generous you want to be, and also with which type of targeting you want to use. I think going back to South Africa, I think, and that's where governments are important, and civil society. Our only, I think, main plea is whatever you do, it needs to respect the budget, because budget is important, it needs to be sustainable, and it perhaps doesn't need to affect the long-term future of a country. That's perhaps the way we would see. Within these parameters, I think there is a lot of room for discussion. There is poverty-focused programs, there are categorical programs, there are affluency tests. Sometimes we want to say, just exclude the top 20% of the population because they don't need it. And some may be universal. If the resources are there, and that's where the resource mobilization is very important, I think it is good to have a discussion on what's the optimal. my point, where I would like to do, is that, we shouldn't only see available resources as for social protection. There are competing demands that government needs to address. And I think, again, where priority should be, the way you target, it clearly reflects the social contracts. And I think we need to respect that social contract. Now, on us opposing, I think it may be a bit strong word. I think the way we operate is we discuss with government what to finance. And there must be a common agreement that it is a priority for the government, but it is also a priority or something we actually do agree, because we are responsible to our shareholders. So when we have that agreement, then we have a project. So it doesn't mean that very often the government chooses to finance some programs independently, and that thing it's perfect. It's actually great. So we don't need to see eye in eye 100% with a government to actually cooperate on very important aspects. Now, some issues is where I think and in fact I've worked personally in government, including Venezuela, Bolivia, a little bit of South Africa, where we had, I would say, a quite different view of social protection and overall the social sectors. We had extremely productive discussion and extremely productive collaboration, because a lot of what we do is not necessarily the big picture. It's really these elements of systems that need to be there whatever you do. Even a universal transfer, I'm sorry, you can't just go around and give cash to people. You need to understand who these people are. You need to see who received it. You need to be sure everybody has received it. That's actually quite difficult. You need to avoid double dipping, and you need to have payment systems that actually do it right. And South Africa is pretty, I would say, is a lot of this system, but many countries don't. So universal transfer, I would say 90% of the infrastructure is the same. And we are very much into the business of developing that infrastructure. And that's where I think it would be useful to have a productive discussion. Let's not only speak about the big picture. There maybe we have our disagreement, but with most governments, we agree on building this system. And then that can be used for different purposes. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will just, first of all, note that the issue of the national ID, the digital ID, is a very big issue for us, and there needs to be more engagement around it. And also to mention that we are in court around it, because our argument before the court says that tagging national ID to access to social services like social protection, health, or education amounts to discrimination, and that is against our constitution. So it is something that is very serious. Around the progressive realization and why targeting makes more sense now, for me and for my organization, we have seen that, like I also mentioned earlier, that even if it is well designed, for us it will continue to mean that governments move away further from the goal of universal social protection, and it is very dangerous in our context. That is why even in the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, the language of progressive realization was intentionally left out of that. They do not use the language of progressive realization in that in the Banjul Charter, which is the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. It is because of our context. But also, if the targeting is happening now, and it is what has to happen in the interim, I also want to support, one of the things that we have been agitating for is support to countries to be able to develop comprehensive data and information systems to ease identification. There were a lot of struggles during COVID when government was giving out cash transfers. They didn't know who was who and who was where. And we even had cases of a government minister standing on public television saying, "I'm surprised there are many orphanages in Kampala." And you're like, really? So I think the issue of data supporting those processes for me is very key, because I also agree that there were so many people who benefited from that who should not have benefited from that, including government officials who are sending money to themselves and to their relatives. So supporting the countries to develop, comprehensive data and information systems, I think would be work. But the other key thing, as we look at, if I just say targeting has to happen, is that then we have to look at social. We have to look at quality healthcare, free quality healthcare and education at the bare minimum as components of social protection. I think for us that is very, very critical, coming from the background that the World Bank and IMF pushed liberalization under our throats, and yet we know that the public sector, the private sector is up for profit. And without profit, that is the agenda, it is their main agenda, and it is not something that we can question, and they are not going to go to areas that are most in need, especially in this era of the Sustainable Development Goals, where we are going around singing, leaving no one behind. We have seen it, and we have seen it even during COVID, that the private sector cannot deliver us. It can complement, but it cannot deliver us to where we want to get as the people, because there are many challenges that come with the private sector when they come into a space of offering critical services.
Yep. Matthew?
Use this.
Yeah, can I just respond to something Isabel said? Because she mentioned national development and social cohesion. It's a plea to the World Bank that we don't just think in terms of sort of arithmetical short-term poverty reduction, but we think in terms of national development, and governments, when they're working well, and populations within countries know the most about their very complicated histories, cultures, what it takes to develop the nation. We saw in Nepal the development of universal programs there through the Civil War, and their expansion with cross-party support after the Civil War. Yet we saw the World Bank suggesting, as I mentioned earlier, that should all be dismantled and those programs should be poverty targeted. Yet the evidence suggests they've been part of the social contract. They've been part of a picture where tax revenue as a proportion of GDP has risen year to year, when it's been static in other countries in the region. And to me, that suggests a lack of awareness about the social contract and the political context, as does programs we see elsewhere, which remain essentially donor-funded programs in Ethiopia, poverty-targeted programs, and Tanzania. And there's a need to get closer to the politics and to get away from the short-term focus on on reducing poverty. It's national development that ultimately matters for poverty reduction. And there is a difference in understanding on social registries. I mean, one thing about social registries is that they only cover, I think on average, a minority of the population. Second thing is, are they any good for administering individually based universal benefit? I mean, they can't be if they only cover a minority of the population. And they involve big money social registries. Wouldn't that money be better spent on the national ID schemes that Angela was talking about, so those twins could both get benefits? I'd be interested to hear more about that.
Okay, and being mindful of the time, just wanted to see if anyone from the audience had any questions for any of our panelists. All right, with that, I guess, I'd like to invite, oh, I'm sorry.
lot of this has come from advice and conditions that are oftentimes softer conditions. And you say it comes from a good place in terms of data, in terms of you have to start somewhere. But something that Mark said that was completely shocking that I think you should take back is if you don't agree what rights do you have, then push back against people who are telling you that in our particular context, this is not working. Because right now we're talking about the evolution and transformation of the world back. But we don't see, the first evolution that has to happen is recognizing that there's a value in what the people you're purportedly serving are telling you, right? Because if our goal in many of our countries, what any of our, and I speak to our leaders as well, they will tell you they will want is social protection, but they have been told it's not possible by you. And because you have a lot of, and you do have a lot of power, I want you to first of all acknowledge the power you have, which is unquestionable, in setting our budgets, in setting our policies. It is why if I wanted to push change, I'm more likely to come to you, to use you to push change, which is a very sad reality because it strips us of that agents that we should have with our government. But because for many of us, there's a lot of money, you control so much of the financing, that is a key thing. So that is the first thing I would want you to acknowledge, because in acknowledging that power imbalance, it means your approach is questioned with a sense of humility, simply what would work in your context. And the second thing is, if the World Bank is saying that poverty targeting is moving you towards universal social protection, you say you have a similar goal, we just have a different way of getting there. What is the plan? Like, what is the evidence? After how many years are we supposed to be getting social protection? In what ways are the other things you're financing or other policy advice building onto this, such that you are not just stopping? Because right now, you've been saying that, you've been doing all social protection for at least in our country of 2015 or so. But when we look at the steps that are going to get us to that goal of universal social protection, they are not really there. What we are seeing are steps to get us to a point where maybe the poor are covered. And the evidence that the World Bank stands is that it's only the poor that will need social protection. If that's the case, then we cannot possibly have the same goal.
Can I add a very brief question? And since the microphone doesn't work, I just I guess I wonder, it sounds to me that the main obstacle in pushing for universal systems is the budget, and so the fiscal constraints. And yet, at least what we heard in Matthew's presentation is that in a number of quite low-income countries, we do have universal programs. No, Nepal, I think, is sort of a very often cited case. And also when we think about the times when many of the European countries introduced their welfare systems, they roughly have the same GDP levels as many of the low-income countries do that we are talking about today. So I do worry that we're setting the current low and middle-income countries at a different threshold compared to many of the European or higher-income countries that have more developed universal systems today. And I worry that we're never reaching sort of a bridge of that gap. But I would also go back to Angela's point on connecting the discussion very purposefully to taxation. In fact, what is currently discussed in the other room is sort of taxing the super rich and using some of that for public services and social protection. So it seems to me that these need to come much more hand in hand. And I understand that your team, for instance, is more focused on the social protection side, but perhaps working more together with some of the macroeconomic teams that are advising on the fiscal side, progress could be made. So I have a question.
Thank you. You touch important questions, and I think this would require long discussion. But I mean, first we may have influence, but believe me, we are struggling in many countries to convince governments that borrowing IDA resources for social safety nets, properly targeted programs, is a good investment. actually, and that's us trying to use our influence to borrow, for the government to borrow. So we are actually facing quite a lot of questions about the sustainability. We keep giving these loans and sending these loans, and okay, when is going to be stopped? And honestly, that relates squarely on the question of resource mobilization, which I think will require countries eventually to develop so that a social protection system can expand. Like in middle-income countries, we are facing a substantially different discussion on social protection than in countries with much lower fiscal capacity. So there, I think, for us, it is a long-term agenda. It's mostly relates to resource mobilization, the ability to target and recover some of the cost through taxation. So it is not going to be in 5 years. But let me tell you something. I think just look 10 years ago, I think we are now having the IMF going to countries and saying, please use your social protection system. Please, there is a crisis, protect the poor. I mean, honestly, 10, 15 years ago, that wasn't there. So I think already, I think we have some part of the merit on pushing and pushing and pushing. And so I think, let's also look at the pressure. And I think many of these programs, which I think many of them we help establish, we help strengthen, are here to stay. Now, yes, for us, sustainability, resource mobilization is essential. And yes, this is, for us, the main argument why we want to target. The more resources, the more generous, the more expansion, the more other services we can add. The poor needs much more. I'm actually working on projects on long-term care in many countries where, it's a huge issue. So we are all for expanding, and we're all for changing the way we target and we think social protection, but in a way, in a sustainable manner. That's perhaps the discussion. Just on, I think, on categorical for us is a form of targeting. So that's something. Yes, I think there I think, again, it's a matter of resources and resource mobilization. I mean, New Zealand has, I understand, unless they change a universal pension, social pension, the rest is all voluntary. It's actually not social anymore. I understand. I may be wrong. But I think at some point they had it. That's actually a plentiful, valid story. I think if you can then have the resources to pay for it. I do believe that dialogue with governments on the social contract, what they want to achieve, is essential because social protection eventually is one way to support the citizens, and to the extent that we think it is done in a sustainable way, we are all for actually discussing different means to achieve it.
Okay, thank you. And being mindful of the time, I guess I'd now like to invite each panelist to deliver some brief closing remarks, perhaps a specific ask or something you can point to that you'd like to see the World Bank doing differently on this front to kind of demonstrate its commitment to this. Again, starting with Isabel as she's remote.
Thank you very much, and it's been fascinating debates. I hope that we will continue some of these. I think to the World Bank, my ask would be, can we start looking at social security policy as an economic policy, not as a poverty alleviation policy? In addition to that, can we look at understanding, and this is globally, that the age-old way of distribution of income is no longer relevant for the majority of people on the planet. So in the absence of income coming from jobs, can there be a recognition that income coming through estate distribution from taxation, whether that's income tax, VAT, international ODA, there needs to be a recognition that that is the way to go. It's not a temporary measure. It's a new way of ensuring that people have sufficient, and looking at the kinds of modeling that institutes such as mine have shown that when you have sufficient income circulating, you will have growth from the bottom up, which will then give you the growth. So you don't wait for the growth in order to distribute. You get the growth through the redistribution. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Angela?
Thank you very much. For me, I would like the World Bank not to ignore the sliding scale of vulnerability because today I might be in a good position, but I don't know what is going to happen tomorrow. And that has a number of implications for access to key social services, and would like the World Bank to look at resilient public systems, health, education, but also most importantly, I would like the World Bank to benchmark the African Union Protocol on the rights of citizens to social protection and social security, because it is more holistic, and it takes into consideration the life cycle approach, but also it takes the rights-based approach, and it also looks at emerging crises like the climate change and epidemics. So I believe that it is a wonderful tool that they could look into, and it would be it can be an entry point to for more useful and sustainable discussions with the African Union member states. Since we are doing, since we are the ones that are basically at the edge when you look at the statistics. Thank you.
Thank you. Matthew?
Thanks. Yeah, the link to taxation, just to say, is critical. Connecting social protection spending with resource mobilisation is just an absolutely core way of how governments should function. And I think when you get programs that are sort of dominated by donor spending and that take a lot of time of government officials, I think the whole thing can break down, and that's a real issue. So my asks, link better to politics and social contract. Show a better awareness of that. Link in a transparent way that we can all understand and perhaps challenge if we want to. Look at national development instead of this sort of process of short-term arithmetical poverty reduction, because it's what matters. And governments, when they're working well, and people, national populations must lead there. And like I was saying in my presentation, review current support to social protection, perhaps past support to social protection in terms of what's worked well and what hasn't worked well, leading into sort of lesson learning and when designing future support, considering the costs and benefits much more broadly than just jumping to short-term poverty reduction. All wrapped up, I guess, in the World Bank's current reform process and roadmap. Thanks.
Thank you. And final word to you.
Thank you. I think we had a long discussion already, so I hear you. We look forward to perhaps continuing. I think it's. My only plea is this is perhaps one area where there are strongly different views, but I think, again, I really look forward to also work on areas where we have a lot of common views, because as I mentioned, just look at the progress we did in the past 10 years in putting social protection on the spectrum, and now we need to build these systems that whatever the population we want to reach actually are needed to help the poor, and that's something we can't do alone, and we still need a lot of advocacy with governments to really make make clear the need for these systems to be built. So thank you very much, and looking forward to continue the discussion.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. And as Isabel and others have said, hopefully we can keep the discussion and conversation on this going moving forward. And thanks to everyone for coming.